Good evening. My name is Fiona McPherson, and I will be hosting this evening's event. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Open University to this, our third WorkMaze webinar on how to prepare for an interview. Unlike the last sessions we've had, we are actually going to allow about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for a question and answer session where you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by using the Q&A panel, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. In order to send through a question, if you can select Host from the Ask drop-down menu, type in your question and just click on Send, and then we will try and answer as many as we can towards the end. You may want to leave your question until closer to the end, as you may find that Lizzie will actually cover most of the stuff that you will actually need to know. But obviously, if we get towards the end and you still have questions, if you can start sending those through to me, that would be absolutely great. Also, we may ask you to use the feedback buttons, which you'll also see, and these will help you sort of participate and also give Lizzie some feedback as we go along. We hope you enjoy the webinar and you find the information we're going to provide you with both informative and practical. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Lizzie Bird. Lizzie has been working in recruitment for the past 13 years, and during which time, amongst other roles, she's been the MBA recruitment manager at Arthur D. Little in the UK and Shell, the oil and gas multinational. At the moment, Lizzie works as an associate for WorkMaze and continues to work in recruitment-related activities for a number of clients, both in training line managers on how to interview effectively and managing the end-to-end recruitment cycle for a number of SMEs. So let me hand you over to Lizzie, and I hope you all enjoy today's webinar.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar on preparing for interview. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Fiona. So I'm Lizzie Bird, and as Fiona's just alluded to in her introduction, I've worked in recruitment for the past 13 years, over which time I estimate that I've interviewed at least 2,000 candidates for different types of roles, from graduate positions to senior management. And whilst the experience which I have is across different sectors and different levels, there are many commonalities in the interviewing process and many commonalities in where people go wrong at interview. So over the next 40 minutes, I'd really like to address how to prepare and how to avoid falling into the various traps associated with interviews. And that should leave us some time at the end to allow for questions, as Fiona has suggested. With regards to the structure of the session, I would like to cover these different areas. We'll start with an overview of the selection process and then look at various different types of interview before concluding with some tips on preparation. As Fiona mentioned, one of the activities in which I regularly get involved is training line management and HR on how to interview effectively. So working with those people who sit on the other side of the desk to you. With that in mind, let's start by taking a look from a recruiter's perspective at the selection process. So this diagram depicts the challenges for a recruiter in finding the right person for a role. Looking at the left of the slide, the starting point for a recruiter, once they have established a need to recruit, is to consider the candidate pool. So, for example, when I was working as the MBA recruiter for Shell, this candidate pool was extensive, with over 10,000 MBA students in just Europe alone. And the challenge is to somehow make a prediction from the pool of who will be able to make a positive contribution to the organization. In other words, as a recruiter, I want to make up an effective workforce. But there are a number of factors which will influence the success of that prediction process. The criteria against which each candidate is assessed, the tools and the methodologies that are used to assess, and the interviewer themselves, each of whom brings with them their own set of biases. Looking at this selection process from a candidate perspective, I believe that if you consider and prepare for each of these factors which impact the prediction process, then you're in a far stronger position to do well at interview. And let's start by considering the criteria. criteria could include a number of different elements, key ones of which are captured in this slide. The balance of these criteria is likely to be determined by the drivers behind the recruitment campaign. Looking at MBA recruitment in particular, I would like to suggest that different companies have different reasons for recruiting MBA students. Broadly speaking, I would put them into three categories. Firstly, there are those companies which have an MBA programs which have been developed in order to bring in a group of talented individuals who will, over time, become the senior leadership of the organization. Now, their recruitment processes will be far more focused on potential to develop behavioural competencies and motivation. Secondly, there are those companies which specifically recruit MBA graduates because of the skills and knowledge they have learned and developed through the MBA itself. I'm thinking here of consultants, perhaps in certain divisions within the finance sector. Their focus is more likely to be on the technical skills, behavioural competencies, and fit. Finally, some companies approach business schools because they're looking to recruit individuals with specialist skills, experience, and backgrounds, for example, marketing or finance, and see business schools as a concentrated source of potential candidates. Again, these recruiters are going to focus on technical skills, behavioural competencies, and fit. With regards to technical skills, I am referring here to the know-how that allows you to do your job effectively, examples of which could be functional skills, such as project management and, let's say, the knowledge of Prince 2, or industry knowledge, such as the automotive industry or the hospitality industry, a number of different industries. So given that technical skills are so utterly varied and determined by the specific role, I'm not going to focus on those this evening, except to encourage you to keep up to date with developments in your area of expertise by reading discussions on social media forums, attending relevant conferences, and reading industry-specific journals. Let's take a look now at behavioural competencies. So the competencies on this slide, whilst not exhaustive, are the most common competencies which recruiters assess against. In general terms, recruiters select across three key areas: thinking, doing, and relating to others. Firstly, recruiters want people who are able to think. Competencies in this category could include creativity, innovation, analysis, or even problem solving. But it's all very well thinking. Recruiters also want people who are able to translate thoughts into action in some way. These competencies might involve delivery, achievement, drive, tenacity, learning, and self-motivation. And finally, very few roles, if any, involve working in complete isolation, so recruiters are looking for individuals who can relate to others. And this could include communication, influencing, leading, perhaps team working. When looking to prepare for interview, I would keep this in mind and ensure that you have examples which demonstrate something around all of these three areas. We're going to come and look at preparation a little bit later. Okay, with criteria covered, the next area to look at are the tools and the methodologies which recruiters use to assess candidates. Here are the most common of these. During this interview, I'd like to focus on the first two, which just have an asterisk beside them. Okay, but beyond screening and fit interviews and behavioural competency interviews, bear in mind that technical interviews, case study and guesstimate questions out there, presentation types of interviews, internship assessments are another very common way to assess, and also various assessment centres, which could include group exercises, psychometric testing, for example, verbal, numerical, reasoning tests, and in-tray exercises. Okay, we're going to start with the screening or the fit interviews. And these interviews can often take place on the phone, or if face-to-face, can be in a formal or an informal setting. My advice is really to treat any meeting which you have with a potential employer as an interview. It is just as likely that an employer will be assessing you during an informal chat over coffee as a formal structured interview. A As I'm sure most of you are aware, studies have shown that interviewers make a decision about someone within the first 30 seconds to 2 minutes of meeting them. I have to caveat this by saying that this is the case with untrained interviewers. They then spend the remainder of the interview working to prove themselves right. So they tend to ask easier questions of those candidates they like, and they also tend to disregard information which doesn't fit with their initial decision. Can I have a hands up from those of you who have ever been asked this first question that I've got here? Tell me about yourself. And you should have a hands up button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. If anybody could please put their hands up. Okay. Fantastic. Well, certainly at least a third of you have been asked that question, tell me about yourself. And it can feel like a pretty routine question without focus or purpose if you've ever had it. And indeed, on one occasion, when I asked this of somebody a few years ago, the candidate came straight back at me with a question, well, what do you want to know? My advice is, if you're ever asked this question, not to do this, as it potentially creates a slightly confrontational environment, but instead to use this question to sell yourself and to engage with the interviewer, to want to hear more about you. Let's take a look at some preparation that you could do for this question. Okay. I suggest that you prepare for this question by considering your unique selling points, and that you then weave these into an answer which is no more than, say, a couple of minutes long. My advice here is to spend 1.5 to 2 minutes answering the question. I have to say that upon answering this question once, I was faced with an 11-minute monologue, and I strongly advise you to avoid this at all costs. But by the same token, you want to say something more than 10 seconds on this one. As I mentioned before, you want to engage with the interviewer at this point. A common approach which people take is to summarize the content of their CV very much in chronological order. But from my perspective, this is a waste of time and opportunity, particularly if you see that the interviewer has your CV in front of them. This is your opportunity to bring your experience to life and to sell yourself into the role. Whilst you might start with a sentence along the lines of, well, as you see from my CV, I've got experience in the recruitment industry, the common threads which run through all of my experiences, whether they be work, academic or social, are ... and I would then talk about those. So bring out your strengths here. Draw links between you and the role for which you're applying. Add information about something that isn't on your CV, perhaps an interest or a social activity, maybe even your motivation. Essentially, you've got a blank page here on which to write whatever you want, so use that opportunity. Feed the interviewer with nuggets of information which you'd like to talk more about in follow-up questions. It's really worth spending some time preparing for this answer, since as soon as you have your clear message, you can adapt it to different circumstances and different questions. Okay, so let's go back to the list of the different types of interviews. And looking back at the series of questions, I'm not going to go through each and every one of them, but I do believe there's a difference in approach to these types of questions demonstrated by candidates who are excellent than the approach demonstrated by, frankly, fairly average candidates. Excellent candidates use these types of questions to sell themselves rather than to just answer them on face value. For example, let me just take one of them. How would your friends describe you? Upon asking that question, I have received the most extraordinary of answers, including from one person, well, I don't really have many friends at business school. People don't seem to like me here. Now, whilst that is extreme, my point is that he was answering the question without really considering the context of it. The fact of the matter is, as an interviewer, I'm very unlikely to go and ask your friends to describe you, but here is an opportunity to tell me about your strengths and possibly throw in a weakness to demonstrate a level of self-awareness. Use the question. Be strategic. I would just like to touch upon one other question which is on this slide, which is a very common question and one that's not very popular from a candidate perspective, which is, what are your 3 key weaknesses? Again, this is a relatively common question, and I'm sure that many of you have had it, and one which, frankly, very few candidates really answer well. I think the days of trying to hide a strength as a weakness are, over, and they certainly should be. I've certainly come across many a perfectionist in my line of work. Instead, look at this question as an opportunity to demonstrate self-awareness and an ability to learn and to develop. The best answers start from a point of truth. As an interviewer, I want to hear that you have firstly recognized the weakness. Now, that might possibly have been via feedback from somebody else, then acknowledged it and have actively sought to do something about it. A nice approach to start with is something along the lines of, 2 years ago during my appraisal process, I received feedback from my manager that XYZ, and then to talk about your development journey since that point. A lot of people struggle with this question, so my advice is to go back and to look at your old appraisal processes, or failing that, to get feedback from other people so that you can start to develop a sincere and considered response to it. Okay, it's incredibly tempting to be flippant with this response, to perhaps mention that your 3 weaknesses are wine, chocolate, and women, or whatever it might happen to be, but I would encourage you to really give it some thought and think about how you can sell yourself and, more importantly, demonstrate some self-awareness. As a word of caution, needless to say, don't reference one of your weaknesses as being a key skill which the company is looking for. So in your own time, do take a look at these questions and consider how you would answer them. Keep in mind that the interview is a selling opportunity. So with that answer, think about how you can use the opportunity to demonstrate your skills and your motivations. Okay, I'd like to move on to behavioural competency interviews now. And behavioural competency interviews are based on the premise that past behaviour is the best indicator of future performance. These types of interviews are extremely common in Western Europe and the United States, and increasingly worldwide. These are the types of questions which begin with something along the lines of, please give me an example of a time when you've led a team, you've influenced a group of people, you've made a difficult decision, that sort of thing. Now, from my perspective as a recruiter, this is where most candidates fall down at interview, and it is very clear to me where people have prepared and where they haven't. So let's take a look at a useful model to help you to prepare. When I train interviewers how to interview, I train them using this model, which is very widely used for behavioural competency interviews. Some of you may well be aware of it and have come across the STAR model before, but even so, I think it is worth revising it, since it is key to structuring a good answer. So, you've been asked a question along the lines of, please give me an example of a time when you've planned and delivered a piece of work. The first thing you need to do in answering that is to provide the context, here described as the situation. Explain your role, where you were working, when it was, who you were working with, perhaps who you were reporting to. This answer should be no more than 2 sentences long. Then move on to the task. Again, this should be no more than 2 sentences, but it should be full of information and of data. The objective with specific targets, for example, how would you measure success, the budget, the time frame, and anything else which defines the task that you're doing. The body of the interview answer should be around the action stage. This is where you describe what you personally did and how you did it, which allowed that task to be achieved. Behavioural competency questions are really focused on the how, so do make sure that you're able to articulate this. Make reference to who was involved to cover relationships, and finally, the results. How did you measure success? Link this back to your original task, but also consider other results such as learnings, feedback, and the wider implications of the work that you did. An interviewer may spend up to 15 minutes talking with you about just one example, so you really do need to have thought through in advance the details of the example. It is terribly frustrating as an interviewer to be faced with the answer, "Oh, I can't really remember." Do expect that the interviewer will ask you some probing questions about the example that you provide. It is very unlikely that you'll be expected to just give the whole answer without any intervention from the interviewer. So be flexible in your response and make sure that you answer the interviewer's question. Okay. This is another example of a behavioural competency question, which is quite a common one, so you might want to think about how you would go around answering it. And the question is, please describe an example of a difficult decision you have had to make. Okay, I've provided here some typical follow-up questions that I might be asking once I've asked that initial question and once I've got the situation and the task out of the way. So how did you gather the information? How did you deal with missing or conflicting information? What criteria did you use to make the decision? Why was that? What options were available to you? What were the risks? How did you mitigate these risks? What decision did you make? And how do you know whether you made the right decision? So what I'd like to do now is to show you an example of the type of assessment matrix that an interviewer might use to assess your answer once we've been through that question. Okay, I appreciate that the wording here is very small, so I hope everybody's able to read it. And I also hasten to add that this is a matrix which I have created, and it is not one used by any of the companies which I work for or for which I have worked in the past. So as you'll see, there are 5 columns, with columns 1, 3, and 5 described. Across each row, there is a common theme. In the top row, the theme is about gathering information, with 1 describing how someone not aligned with the company's approach would behave, 3 describing someone who would meet the expectation, and 5 describing someone who would far exceed expectation. As an interviewer, I would make an assessment of you based upon the evidence which I'd gathered at the interview. Companies using behavioural competency interviews will have defined their own indicators based upon the behaviours which lead to success within their organisation. So, whilst 2 companies may both look for people who are prepared to make decisions, how you make effective decisions within each of these organisational cultures may be slightly different. That information is what you might call the DNA of the company, and that's very much a closely guarded secret. It does explain, however, why you may be successful at one company and not another company within the same field. Now, the difference between an average and an excellent candidate is that an excellent candidate can clearly describe the process of decision-making which they went through and how they executed it. Okay, so we've covered criteria and methodologies at this stage. Let's have a look at the final aspect which needs consideration in preparation for an interview, and that's the interviewer themselves. Okay, interviewers are the aspect which is perhaps the hardest to plan and prepare for, since there are so many variables which just can't be anticipated. However, I do think there are some general tips which you should consider. The first tip sounds pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people are late to interview. I would estimate that about 5% of all candidates I've ever seen have been late. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is that people underestimate the length of time that it can take to get through the reception procedure in some large companies, and particularly watch out if you've got that 9 o'clock slot in the morning. Make sure that you take all of those administration issues into account when planning your journey and check for roadworks, tube lines, etc. in advance. If you know that you're going to be late, call up the company as soon as you're aware of this and provide them with an estimated arrival time. And if you are late, do apologise. I've noticed that some candidates who are only just late, say 5 or 10 minutes, seem to think that if they don't mention it, it's as though it didn't happen. So don't fall into this category. With regards to dress, I would always encourage you to err on the side of caution and overdress rather than underdress. This is a good area on which to do your research. Social media and technology companies are likely to be a lot more relaxed than financial services about dress, but check in advance and make sure that you're in something that is comfortable and professional. I suggest that you take a couple of copies of your CV with you to interview, one for the interviewer and one for you. I truly think that there's no harm in having a copy of your CV to make reference to during an interview, particularly if you get stuck and have a mind blank. Watch your handshake and your eye contact. Interviewers often find it very disconcerting if you don't look at them regularly, though I appreciate that there are some cultural differences in this area. If an interviewer is interrupting you during an interview, it is probably with good cause. Possibly that they have all the information that they need from you, or that the information that you're providing is irrelevant. Okay, so be sensitive to interviewers trying to manage time, and please don't talk over them. I often find that when I try to interrupt candidates, instead of taking that as a hint, candidates simply talk louder, so just watch out for that. Now, do offer your business card at the end of an interview if you'd like to, and if the interviewer wants to give you theirs, this is the perfect opportunity for them to do so without having to ask. A slight variation on the sign seen in many a local shop regarding credit: don't ask for business cards, as refusal often offends. And finally, you may well have looked up the profile of the interviewers on LinkedIn, and I'd certainly suggest that you do this as part of your research. But don't be tempted to be over-familiar. Frankly, it can feel a little bit creepy if you're not careful. So do smile, do engage, and do build rapport. But remember, those first 2 minutes are important, so make sure you make the most of them and give the interviewer a positive impression. Okay. I'm just conscious of time, and I'd like to sort of start to draw to a close. So if you do have any questions, perhaps now's the time to start thinking about them. But what I would like to do, I've got around 3 slides left. And firstly is to provide you some insights from a recruiter's perspective. Particularly, I'd like to pick up on where some candidates go wrong at interview. Now, in my opinion, there are 3 main areas, of which only the first is an acceptable reason not to get through the process. This reason is that the candidate doesn't have the relevant experience upon which to draw, or behaviours aren't aligned with the company's requirements. So let me give you an example of this. I was recruiting an MBA student about 3 years ago, and I was on campus, and I asked the question about a time the candidate had had to deal with a difficult stakeholder. Immediately, the candidate referenced one of his classmates who he described as intolerable, and described him as a style of management which was very Western. So I asked him how he dealt with this, and his response to me was that he decided to sabotage his work. I was intrigued, needless to say, and so I asked him what that actually involved. And he responded that he had to do a presentation in front of the whole class and in front of the professors, and he got access to this person's laptop and sabotaged the content of the presentation. So when he got up to stand up in front of all the class and many of the professors, the presentation had been altered. So I asked the candidate, well, what was the effect of this? To which he smiled and looked at me with a very, very happy grin and said, as is so often the case with sabotage, it worked perfectly. So I asked him, well, what was the response to this from the candidate? From his fellow classmate. How does he deal with him now? And he responded that he would do anything to cross the street, never to have to speak to this person again. Now, from my perspective, from the company that I was interviewing with, I had a very clear indication of how this person behaved, and it was very clear to me that this behavior wasn't aligned with the company's requirements. So I was confident in the decision that this person wouldn't fit. I fed back to the candidate when he'd asked for some feedback and explained it to him, to which he smiled and said, "You made the right decision, Miss Bird." So I was perfectly confident with that. And that's a reason that is acceptable, I would say, for a candidate not to get through. But let's look at the other couple of areas here. Secondly, the candidate does have relevant experience, but chooses the wrong example. And again, I'm going to take an example of somebody that I've interviewed again at business school, and this was a candidate with 4 years of experience working at HSBC, 3 years in a team and 1 year as a manager, and asked this question of a time when she had had to work with a group of people and there was diversity in the team. Despite all the years that she'd worked at HSBC, she selected to give me an example of a time when she had worked with a team at business school to put up a tent. And the diversity that she'd had to deal with was one of the individuals within the group was rather short, and so they dealt with that by giving them tasks that weren't very high up. Now, looking at this candidate's CV, it was absolutely shameful that this was the experience and this was the example that the candidate had chosen. And I think partly that was because she hadn't really prepared any examples. And in this respect, she was somewhat of a rabbit in the headlights, and that was the first thing that came to her mind. But it really didn't show off her team-working skills, I think, to their optimum, certainly on the basis of her CV. So that was incredibly disappointing. And that's a very, very familiar story to me as an interviewer. Another aspect that often happens is that candidates don't listen to the question. And this tends to happen with candidates that perhaps over-prepared a little bit and are very keen on telling their story come what may. So do make sure that with your preparation, you still remain listening to the question. And the third reason that I've put here is that candidate has the relevant experience and selects a good example, but cannot externalize the information. So often candidates talk too much or use very irrelevant information, or they demonstrate arrogance. A number of different examples I could provide there, but I'll just keep it to one. One example, again, at business school, when I asked a candidate of a time when they had managed a piece of work from beginning to end, and their response was, well, as you normally do. So I was trying to get evidence of how somebody had planned a piece of work, how they'd perhaps dealt with some obstacle, mitigated any problems that they had anticipated. And every time I asked a question, well, could you describe to me a little bit what that meant? Well, I used a project plan, as you always do. And that was the type of response that I got. My feeling that I got from that was this was a very arrogant candidate, but I don't think it was really what her intention was. I think ultimately she didn't really know what I was trying to get at. She hadn't fully appreciated that she was in a position where she needed to describe what she did so that I could get a picture of how she did that within the context of a behavioural competency interview. Okay, so in summary of where candidates go wrong, I've spoken in large part about many of these, but I would just like to pick one out which I haven't mentioned, and that is abuse within an interview, and that is the section that says the using we within an interview. Okay, particularly with regards to behavioural competency interviews, the focus of attention for the interviewer is to find out how you did something and how you behaved. The interviewer is not assessing your team, but they're assessing you and your behaviour within that team. It is important, therefore, that you talk about I. Now, I do know that this can be particularly challenging for certain individuals, either due to cultural background or perhaps even to the culture of the employing company from which you come. However, it really is important in this style of interview that you talk about I rather than we. Okay, so just as I start to close off this presentation, I'd like to give you some final tips for preparation. Okay, the first point here is check the instructions, time, location, and format. And again, this first point sounds pretty obvious. However, a colleague of mine at Shell was once conducting a 45-minute telephone interview with a candidate in India. Unfortunately, the candidate had not properly read the invitation letter and had managed to get themselves over to the UK and into Shell Centre in London for the interview, frankly, much to everyone's surprise. Ironically, the interviewer was working from home on that day, so a room had to be found in Shell Centre for the candidate to sit and have his telephone interview. An expensive mistake for both the candidate and Shell. So do make sure that you've checked those instructions time and time again. Research is extremely important to find out about the process, the company, and the industry, and also the interviewers. Okay, so please do your research here. Talk to anybody that's been through the interview process themselves and glean any bits of information that you can. As I mentioned before, do prepare behavioural competency examples. My tip here is to take 4 to 5 achievements of which you are very proud, and then to dedicate a side of A4 paper to each one of those. So, for example, write the situation and the task in clear, concise sentences. Then list a series of bullet points for all of the actions which you took and which helped you to achieve the task. Make a list of the people involved in the example. And finally, clearly identify the results using quantifiable data if you can, but also referencing any learnings, any feedback, and what you do differently. Once you've done that, put behavioural competency questions into any search engine and just have a look at what comes up. Consider which of your examples you would use for different questions, and very importantly, which of the action bullet points would be relevant in an answer. If you come across a question that you couldn't answer with one of your examples, think about how you'd go around answering it. If you know that taking psychometric tests, such as verbal and numerical reasoning tests, is going to be something that's expected of you, do practice these in advance. There are many sources of these tests, but you might want to start by looking at Saville and Holdsworth's site, which is shl.com, for some practice, and Saville and Holdsworth actually developed those tools. For technical interviews, I would certainly read upon the latest technical developments in your field, as I suggested right at the beginning of this webinar. And I also suggest that you prepare some questions to ask during the course of the interview. It's always good to have some up your sleeve, but please don't ask questions for which the answers could be easily found on the company's website. Finally, my last bit of advice is try to relax and enjoy the process. Remember, despite all of the methodologies and the criteria, an interview is just a structured conversation and interaction between two or more people. Just as the interviewers are assessing you, you are assessing them, and it's very much a two-way process. Okay, so I've kept to time this time, and I hope that I've covered the content of my presentation. Just before I hand over for questions, I would just like to inform you about the next webinar in the series, which is on the 25th of April, and the webinar is about networking, networking being a key element of job searching. And so in this one, we're going to look at how it fits into your job search strategy, the do's and don'ts of networking, and I hope I'll be answering any questions on obstacles and solutions to networking. Okay, so I will now hand over to you for any questions that you may have.
Okay, that's great. Oh, they're coming through thick and fast now. Finished.
Thank you, Fiona.
I've got a question from Angela, which is sort of really relating to going for internal interviews.
Mm-hmm.
When you're being interviewed by people who've already met you, it can be difficult to provide examples that relate to the selection criteria. And when they know your work, she's just wondering if you had any advice you could give, or whether you'd make any sort of changes to the usual approach for that.
Okay, thank you very much. So Angela, thank you very much for that question. And again, internal process is very, very much indeed, but my advice was to use the principles that I've offered here. So the first thing I would do would be to be clear on your unique selling points. So have that really clear in your mind as to what it is that you can offer, so that your messages are coming through thick and fast, I guess, in that respect. I fully appreciate that people may well have experienced some of the work and been involved in some of the projects that you've worked with, but nonetheless, I would still prepare them in the same way, because if you're being asked to go through a formal process in this respect, then they will want to be hearing that you have understood what process you've gone through and how you behaved, and that you can really articulate that. What I would also encourage you to do is try to think of a variety of different examples, perhaps from different projects that you've worked in, perhaps when you've worked with different stakeholders to the ones that will be meeting you, or something that you've done outside of work that would just provide a little bit of flavour of something that they don't know about you. But stick with the structure, prepare some examples using STAR, think about what you've really got to sell with your unique selling points, and base them around that. Again, do your research as to what the structure of the interviews are going to be like, how formal they're going to be or not formal they're going to be, so that you can really prepare accordingly for that. But general advice is stick pretty much to the same types of principles that we've discussed here. Okay?
Okay, next question is from Maria. Are there any good questions to ask at the end of an interview?
Okay, good questions at the end of an interview. Thanks very much for that question, Maria. There are no particular good questions that I've heard. I think if you're genuinely interested in the job, you're likely to have some questions that you're genuinely interested in hearing the answer to. However, I think if you get stuck at any point, it's always good to reference back to what the interviewer has said about themselves. So, for example, they might have told you that they've worked at the company for the past 7 years. So you could ask them, what's kept them there. You might want to reference something that you've read on the website and said that you recognize that this is something that the company particularly prides themselves in. And how do they anticipate that would be demonstrated in the role that you're applying for, or how is that demonstrated in their role? Just to demonstrate that you've really sort of taken on board the company ethos and their values and what they're doing. As I say, do try to avoid asking anything that the answer of which you could find on the website. In your first round interview, I would avoid talking about finances and talking about the package. But if you've done your research, you've spoken to a number of people, and let's say this is the fourth person you've met, and you've genuinely got no more questions to ask, then rather than just try and come up with some questions to fill time, I would actively say, I've had plenty of opportunity to do my research. I've spoken to a number of people through this process, all of who have been very generous in giving me some time. So I think at this stage, all of my questions have been answered, but thank you very much indeed for offering me the opportunity. I would far rather a candidate did that than to just fill time with making up questions. Okay, Maria, I hope that helps.
Okay, the next one we have is from Desi. What advice can you give to someone who has the theoretical knowledge but has no experience in the field? For instance, this is their first break to get into their desired role. They may have just graduated, or parents who've had a long leave to take care of children.
I'm so sorry. Could you start that one again, Fiona? I do apologise.
It's all right. What advice can you give to someone who has the theoretical knowledge but has no experience? For instance, someone who just graduated, or for parents who have been on long leave to take care of children.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think that question was from Debbie. Thank you for that question. In terms of that, I think that when we're looking at behavioural competency questions, the joy of behavioural competencies is that you can take examples from any aspect of your life. So if you've just graduated, there are plenty of opportunities that you will have had to have worked with other people potentially, to have maybe led a team, to have made decisions, particularly also if you've just been looking after a family and haven't been in the work environment for a while as well. There are plenty of transferable skills that you can take. Now, as an interviewer and a recruiter, what I'm interested in is hearing about the behaviour. Ideally, it would be set within a work context, but it absolutely doesn't need to be set within a work context. If I'm interested enough in your CV and I'm asking you to interview, I'm wanting to know more about you. So you can rest assured on that one. So I would look at various different aspects of your life. So if it's extracurricular activities, perhaps some activities that you've been involved in work. For example, the decision-making process, it could be a decision about going back to work. It could be about a decision about going back to study before going back to work, or a number of different aspects. But please don't think that you don't have the right experiences in order to do that. You've got some experiences and you've got various different behaviours, and you just need to start articulating them and thinking about different experiences from your life that allow you to do that. So I hope that helps and to give you some confidence. I'm very accustomed when recruiting graduates to expect that people don't have experience from the work environment, but very, very strong graduates, for example, demonstrate all of these activities in just other aspects of their life. So have confidence.
Okay, thanks for that, Lizzie. The next one comes from Paula. She said, you mentioned handing over a business card, and she just wondered, is this appropriate if you have been put forward by a recruitment agency?
My answer to this...
the contact details.
Absolutely. I completely understand that. You might just want to check with your recruitment agency beforehand, but certainly my experience has been that candidates are very happy to run through that. It's highly unlikely that a company is going to go and try and bypass the recruitment agency. They would already have contracted into doing something. And in that respect, often it's a courtesy to do so. Certainly, interviewers might well offer you a business card at the beginning or at the end of an interview. If they do so, you're more than welcome to hand over your business card as well. So my advice would be, if you feel very uncomfortable about it, I would just check with your recruitment agency. But ultimately, the people that are going through the recruitment process, the company, will have signed some form of contract in that respect. So it will be their obligation to stick by the terms of that contract. Okay.
Okay.
That helps, Paula.
Okay. The next one comes from Anna Maria. How do interviewers for international positions consider cultural differences and people for whom English is not their native language?
Okay, Anna Maria, thank you very much indeed for that question, a very relevant question. Companies vary tremendously, and I'd love to be able to say that every company takes it into account very carefully. What I can say is that all the international companies with which I have worked, when they're putting together the criteria and the indicators of behavior, so, for example, the slide that I demonstrated about decision-making and how an assessor would look at that, they incorporate into that cultural elements so that a candidate could answer in all number of different ways and could have done things slightly differently, but still have fallen into the broad brush approach of how you work effectively within that company. And so large multinational companies will have piloted that and tested it across the world. So have confidence that that has happened with large organizations. With large organizations as well, most interviewers are trained on how to interview, and cultural differences are taken into account, and biases, stereotyping, all of those different areas are things that are considered within interview training. I can't speak for every single company, every single small organization, and I don't want to suggest that all small organizations don't do this. In terms of other approaches that they can take, and particularly around language, my key concern is not necessarily the clever articulation of the story and the behavior. What I want to know is how you behaved. And whether you say that to me in perfect English or whether you tell me in slightly broken English, it's not relevant. What is relevant is your behavior. So a lot of companies will view interviews very much like that. Some companies might give you a little bit more time on the basis that it takes you a little bit longer to articulate if English is not your first language. So companies often take that into account as well. So I wish I could say all companies do things best practice. I fear that they probably don't. But have confidence that a lot of people, particularly those who have been through training, will be very aware of their own biases and will be looking at your behavior rather than just the way that you articulate things. Okay. But sorry, if I just may make one more comment to that, Anne-Maria. I think if English is not your first language, it's even more opportunity to prepare and think about how you want to articulate your answers. And if you are asked a question and you're not fully aware of what they're trying to get at, or it's not entirely clear, please don't be afraid to ask them to rephrase it. As an interviewer, I would far rather a candidate ask me to rephrase something and talks about something that's relevant than goes off on a tangent because they've not fully understood it. Sorry, Fiona. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Just before I go on to the next question, we've still got 10 minutes left, so if you still want to send through any particular questions that you've got, obviously please feel free, because we've got till 7 o'clock, so we're very keen to obviously answer as many as we can. Okay, the next one, and forgive me about my pronunciation if this is wrong, is from Drahamira, who's been asking... normally when you get approached by a recruitment agency, they don't mention the client when they're looking for a candidate. If the client name is not given when invited for interview, is it appropriate to ask for the client name in order to find out more information about the company?
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that question. Yes, at that point it is. If the recruitment agency has asked you in for interview and has asked you to come and talk about a role, and then you've agreed to do so because it's interesting at that level, it's perfectly acceptable for then to ask who the client is. Absolutely. But typically I wouldn't ask that until you've expressed an interest in the role and that you'd like to come and talk to them more about it. So yes, do ask once you've sort of indicated that you're interested in that. I hope that helps.
Okay, no more at this stage, so if you want to send through any more questions, that'd be great. Oh, Jeffamira says thank you.
My pleasure.
By the way, Lizzie. And so does Maria as well, actually,
Thanks
for your answer
very
earlier on. So we'll stay online till 7 o'clock. So obviously if you can still continue to send through any questions, and we will answer them as much as we can do. So we're just waiting for some more to come through. Oh, okay, right, they're coming through again, that's good.
Wonderful.
Michael's asked the question, how do you identify your USP?
Oh, goodness, how to identify your unique selling points. All right, that's a very challenging question, Michael, but thank you very much indeed for asking it. And I think it is a difficult thing to do, as to really to identify what you've got to offer. Now, when I'm looking at your USP, it could be a number of different things that you could be looking at here. So it could be your set of skills, or the combination of the set of skills that you have that are particularly relevant for that type of role or, that you're applying for. It could be something about your passion and your interests. So, for example, you're applying to the sports industry, and your USP could be something to do about the extracurricular activities that you do within the sporting field around coaching and volunteering to do things. And that passion is the aspect that you really want to bring forward within that. So motivations, passions, interests, skills, a combination of those different aspects. When you're having a look at that, I guess there are various different aspects that I would look at. Firstly, I would go and assess what your skills are. So look at your past experiences and consider what are you able to do and how. Look at your technical skills, look at your behavioural skills, whether it be leadership, whether it be bookkeeping and accounts, and really write those down so that you're clear on those. I would look at your interests and think about what motivates you. So what do you do in your spare time? When you pick up the Sunday newspapers, which is the first section that you go to? What keeps you interested there? I would look at your values. Consider about those different elements that make up your value system, whether it be work-life balance, whether it be financial security, time to spend with your family, whatever it might happen to be. And just put together an overall picture of who you are so that you can start to drill down and think, okay, well, what's unique about me? What are my unique selling points, particularly for various different roles? I do think it is challenging, but I think from my experience as an interviewer, when I ask that dreaded question of, tell me a little bit about yourself, the person that comes to life, the person that articulates perhaps a combination of their skills and their motivation, and draws that somehow into the job that I'm looking to recruit for, is the person that captures my imagination and makes me delighted at the thought of spending the next 45 minutes with them, rather than horrified at that thought. So whilst it's challenging, Michael, I think it's worth spending some time doing that. Okay. Okay,
just a quick one regarding CVs. Actually, I can sort of answer this one. Desi's asked about giving advice on preparing a CV so it's attractive enough to secure an opportunity for interview. And I just want to say we actually covered that in last month's webinar, and you can actually obtain the recording by going onto the WorkMaze website. So Desi, if you want to just drop me a line, or I'll send you a quick message back with the details so you can log on and you can actually listen to that webinar, which has got some great sort of hints and tips on how to prepare your CV. Next question from Paula. If you've been given the competencies the company are looking for, what is the best way to anticipate the questions that might arise?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Paula. I think good practice these days, many companies, as you suggested, send out the competencies that they'll be looking for. One of the challenges that you've got here is that you don't know what the indicators are for them, so you can't sort of adjust your question, your answer in that respect. However, if your competencies are sort of teamwork, there could be a number of types of questions that you've got about this. So please give me an example of a time that you've worked in a team or that you've encouraged a team to be successful, or please give me an example of a time that a team that you've worked in hasn't been successful. So you could be thrown by having either side of that particular point, I guess. I would go back to what I'd originally suggested of think about 4 or 5 achievements from your past experience, whether they be work-related or extracurricular, voluntary work, whatever type of experience, and start to really dissect those and to break those down into different aspects of them. And then look at the relationship between the competencies that you know the company is looking for and your experiences, and what aspects of them you perhaps need to bring out. I don't think you can really anticipate every single question that you might possibly get, but I do think by having some confidence in the experiences that you've got and being able to articulate them whilst listening to the question will stand you in good stead. So you've got a step up by knowing what the competencies are, but still I would start from the point of looking at your achievements and then relating those competencies to them in some way, because I just don't think we can predict the questions on these ones. So sorry about that, Paula.
Okay, let's have a look what else we've got here. There's a few thank yous coming through, which is very nice. We've got a lovely one from Angela saying thank you. It was really useful. She wished she'd had this advice a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully she'll find it of use in the future. We have also had thanks from Elias saying thank you for taking the time to go through it with us. He really appreciates it. Panagiotis, I'm not very good at this, I apologise. Thanks for a very insightful webinar. He's still in the CV writing process, but did benefit from taking a look down the road, so he'd like to say thank you. Michael's just said thank you for your detailed answer. Moving on, we've got a question from Terry, who's just asked, if you don't get the job, is the firm likely to give you specific feedback on why you didn't get the job, and how can you best get this feedback?
Terry, thank you very much indeed for that question. And I think that getting feedback is incredibly valuable. So most companies that I've worked for have provided feedback. I do have to say that some companies in the United States don't provide feedback, generally as a rule, for various litigious reasons. But in the UK they often do, particularly if you've been invited to interview. So they might not give you feedback after just your CV, but if you've met with somebody, they could well do so. My advice would be to phone up a couple of days after the interview and ask whether you could get some feedback from the interview. On the basis of this, they might say, whatever decision it is, could I have some feedback? Now, they'll either say yes or no to this, but if they say yes, I think that's a really, really valuable point for you. With regards to feedback, and if you do get it, my advice would be to set the scene that you want it for development purposes, because I think one of the company's big fears in giving feedback is that their decision is going to be questioned and it's going to become a very confrontational conversation, which makes people not want to involve themselves in that conversation in the first place and therefore shy away from feedback. So if you set up the scene and say, look, I'd really like to get some feedback because I want to make sure that I learn from this experience and can take it to my next interview, could you please provide me with some feedback? You're setting the scene there when it's not going to be confrontational. And I would suggest it's always worth a go. I have to say, some people ask me for interview feedback as soon as the interview had finished. It takes a very brave person to do that. My advice is probably not to do that. It can be a little bit confrontational. But at the same point, if you feel that it's an appropriate time to do so, do it on the basis that you're prepared for them to say, I don't think you're ready for this job, or they're far more likely to come back and say to you, I'm very happy to give you feedback, but I need an opportunity to go and reflect upon what you've said before I do so. So that's a likely response you'll get to that. But Terry, always ask for feedback. I think it's a great thing to do.
Okay, this is the last question we've got time for. It's a question from Jamira. If I have no experience as a team leader and it's required, can I use examples from my study teamwork in the interview? Would this be of value?
Absolutely, it would be of value. So if you haven't got it within the work experience, please do reference something that you've done it in study. Absolutely. Because again, what I would like to hear from a recruitment perspective is your behaviour about how you've led a team, and it is less relevant to me where you've got that experience of doing so. So if you can articulate it and perhaps talk a little bit about how you came to be the team leader within that environment, so whether you were elected as such or whether you volunteered yourself, how many people were in it, it was a group of peers, so it was a number of challenges associated with it. I think that many a good candidate has provided some good examples from study groups. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty much it. I just want to say we've had a thank you from Paula. I just want to wish you good luck. She has an interview on Tuesday and now feels very equipped to prepare for it. So good luck for Tuesday.
Fantastic. Good luck.
And obviously we'd like to thank you all for attending. I hope you all found it really useful. As Lisa said earlier, we do have our next webinar in March, in April. Time skipping ahead, on actually doing networking, so we'd love to see you there. You will be able to get access to a recording of this webinar and the previous ones via the WorkMaze website, so please do visit if you've missed anything. I know a couple of people came in a bit later on, so you can get access to the full webinar from there. And I'd just like to thank Lizzie very much. We've had some great feedback, and I know a lot of you out there have found it really useful. So thank you very much. I'll just hand you over to Lizzie just so she can say thanks as well.
Thank you very much indeed for your time, and also for the notes of thanks, and also for those very helpful and useful questions. I'm delighted to hear that it's been of some help, and good luck for the forthcoming interviews that you may well have. I look forward to speaking to you on the 25th of April. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.